hit. Thank you very much, Laura. So the event rather is now being recorded. On that note, I'll welcome us to the 7th. I can't believe it's the 7th BAFTSS Horror SIG Wednesday Night Bite event. This event is kind of got 2 parts to it because it's a screening and discussion of the film The Quiet Revolution, which I'm hoping you've all had the chance to watch and enjoy prior to this event. Now, if you don't know me, because this is the first event I've chaired, I think, for the BAFTSS SIG events, I'm Kate. I'm one of the SIG conveners along with Laura and Shelley. And we're really pleased tonight, or this morning for some people, including Ernest. I think it's 10 o'clock with you right now. Is that right, Ernest, in Canada? We're really pleased to have the co-writers and co-director of that film here for a discussion about it, its creation, and the kind of key insights that it offers in terms of our understandings of Canadian horror cinema and its history. So I'm going to introduce them. First of all, we have Xavier Mendik, who I'm sure many of you are aware of, but just to give you a bit of background, he's a professor of cult cinema studies at Birmingham City University, where he also runs the annual Cine Excess International Film Festival. He's the author, editor, and co-editor of 9 volumes on cult cinema traditions, and he's also completed 12 documentaries on cult cinema, which obviously includes The Quiet Revolution, which he co-directed and co-wrote. And then we also have Professor Ernest Mathijs, who again, I'm sure many of you are aware of. He's a professor of film and media studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. His most recent book is The Routledge Companion to Cult Cinema, co-edited with Jamie Sexton. And he's also the author of monographs on something which I know is one of his first loves, David Cronenberg and his cinema, and also a book on ginger snaps. And Ernest is the co-writer of The Quiet Revolution. So what we're going to do, and I'm sure many of you are used to this format now from previous events, I'm going to kind of open things up with a discussion about the film with Xavier and Ernest for around 20 minutes to half an hour. And then we'll open things up to questions from all of you on, on any aspects of the film. Don't feel though that you have to wait until the second half to post your questions in the chat. Post them in the chat at any point in the next half an hour, and we'll be sure to pick those up and to ask Xavier and Ernest in the second half of this session. Okay, so welcome Xavier and Ernest to this event. It's brilliant to have you here. And I wanted to start with quite a broad question, and it's one that I alluded to there in my introduction really, which is, what do you see as being kind of the key ways in which this film contributes to our understandings of maybe not just Canadian horror cinema, but horror cinema in general?
I guess first of all, really, it's about reinscription, because I mean, horror cinema, whether it's Canadian horror cinema or not, is always bound up with notions of national cinema and the potential conflict you have between notions of accepted and marginal cinema. And I think, and Ernest probably agrees, Canadian horror is no exception to that. So really there were 3 levels of reinscription to this, reinscribing some of those missing voices, industrial voices, production voices from the 1970s that have been marginalized because of their association with funding strategies. And then Ernest, I know the things you were interested in were around the Canadian Film Centre and indigenous horror, and you might want to say a little bit about those.
Yeah, it's kind of what Xavier said. It's an attempt to position horror cinema, Canadian horror cinema in this case, but I think it applies to horror cinema largely. It's to position it, an attempt to position it in an industrial, economic, cultural environment, in a social environment, and also in an environment of active creativity. And that's why interviews with people who are involved in the making and the funding and the distribution of horror cinema were key to the documentary. And Xavier added a lot of material, had a lot of material on the 1970s in the role of Cinepics as an example. And my involvement was more towards the 1990s and the involvement of the Canadian Film Centre. And then together we pushed on towards today, so to speak.
Okay, so it covers a lot of ground. It's quite ambitious in that sense, isn't it? It's in a brilliant way and in a really necessary way. I mean, you mentioned Cinepics there, and I found the stuff about Cinepics particularly fascinating, and that idea that Xavier referred to of going back and rethinking about Canadian horror cinema with regards to production and industry. And why do you think companies like Cinepics were so important to the Canadian horror scene during that period where they were very, very active, sort of in the late 70s?
I think for a number of reasons. First of all, in terms of pure productivity. So they were distributors initially in the kind of French Quebec region. So they were importing films into French Canada that spoke to a new liberated mindset, the so-called Quiet Revolution of the documentary's title. But when they did move into production in the late 60s, 1967, they really developed a through line of production. So in terms of pure massive productions, they're significant in that respect. But also, I guess, all of their key cycles and genres really hit a nerve with what was going on in Canada at that time. So were it not for their association with debased or seemingly debased funding strategies, what Ben Wright has called Canada's great shame, I'm pretty sure they would have been much more sort of central to Canadian national cinema perspectives than they are. I mean, if you look at the great books on Canadian national cinema, you're really hard pressed to find any reference to Cinepics. Even within Bill Marshall's book on Quebec filmmaking, they're a footnote, and that I find really weird. So they were prolific and they really hit the nerve, I think, of what was going on. Though the name may not be a household name, what they become, Lionsgate Films, is a household name. So I guess by proxy, they did become significant, even if that outstripped their initial, production profile.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, or it actually states at the beginning of the documentary that you had to do quite a lot of archival research for this project, and that involved delving into the archives of Cinepics and the Canadian Film Centre. Can you tell us a bit more about what that involved? I mean, particularly in the sense, as you say, Xavier, that there hadn't been really any scholarship on Cinepics conducted prior to this.
I guess, like a lot of so-called exploitation outlets, if history and national identity don't take you, to their heart, you create your own landscape. And this is what Cinepics have very much done. So the two creators of Cinepics were John Dunning, who was an exhibitor by background, and Andre Link, who was a Hungarian emigre and a business partner. And it was a rare relationship that the two had. It really was a perfect marriage. So John Dunning unfortunately died. He stayed around long enough for Cinepics to be incorporated into what is now Lionsgate. But still, I think both Andre Link and Greg Dunning, who appears in the documentary, feel is that Cinepics have not been recognised. So effectively, they set up their own archival resource and estate. And we were able to kind of pilfer a great deal of material from this. Some of this material is online. So there is actually an online.
You there, Xavier?
I think Xavier fell away for a second. I'll fill the gap if you want.
Okay,
it's the same for the Canadian Film Centre as what Xavier said. So it's in a way we were able to access living archives. So people who were involved in the production and the distribution of genre cinema in Canada. And, they have their own collections and they have firsthand testimony. So they're, as living archives, they keep materials and that they were happy to share with us. Some of it is in the process of being institutionalized, meaning that some institutions like the University of Athabasca or UQAM University in in Montreal are acquiring some of these archives, but a lot of it is dispersed across, the people who are still around and hold those materials, and they're very happy to share them. So this aspect of the living archive was one that I found, and Xavier as well found really interesting, because it's a type of a first hand, but there's also a degree of reliability because there's documentation. So you mean, in other words, as an academic, you can cross-reference what people say and check that it's actually the truth, which helps. And in addition, most Canadian libraries, whether they're just the public libraries, hold a wealth of material on the reception and the distribution of Canadian genre cinema. I mean, these films were popular. These films received theatrical releases, so local press and local newspapers reported about them. This was not, and if you look around in the right places, a lot of that material emerges. A documentary is perhaps not the right place for to show stills of newspaper clippings and stuff like that. But there's a lot of documents available, and it also made the research very very lively and very interesting, in that you're not dealing with something dead on paper. It's someone who's talking to you, and the passion. Like someone like Greg Dunning is passionate about this archive and this legacy of Cinepix, and someone like Steve Hoban is passionate about the role that the Canadian Film Centre has played. So that passion was something that, it works better on camera than it is on, written down.
Yeah, it comes alive, I guess, through their accounts, doesn't it? Well, you mentioned that some of the films that are covered in the first and second parts of the documentary, when you're talking about Cinepix and the Canadian Film Centre, were popular. I mean, how films like Valerie and Death Weekend, I'd never heard of those films before. Maybe people in here have heard of them, but I hadn't. Are they readily available now? Are they films that are available for streaming or on Blu-ray or anything like that?
So I knew you were going to ask that, and I should have looked it up, but I didn't. But I have a reason why. Today's the 21st of April, so today is Canada Film Day. This is the 8th time that Canada organizes a National Film Day. Today is that day. So if you want to celebrate Canada Film Day, go look up if Valerie and Death Weekend are available. This can be your contribution to Canada Film Day. And I'm pretty sure that it's a mixed bag. Yes, I mean, most of the people in this room here are scholars, so we can get our hands on pretty much anything. But then the question is also, does this mean it's readily available? I know the Vancouver Public Library holds videotapes and DVD-Rs of Death Weekend and Valerie. So it means it's available to the public. But if you don't know they're there, does that mean that it's like readily available? These films are definitely not being promoted, if that's what you mean. Today is Canada Film Day, and the Vancouver International Film Festival is organizing a slew of screenings, 2 of which are genre films. One is called Goon. It's a film about what in Canada they call a hockey enforcer. So that's someone who plays on the team, ice hockey, just to scare away the opponents. It's kind of like Vinnie Jones, but on ice, if you want. And the other one, there's one genre film. All the rest are documentaries, which Canada is very proud of, or animated films, or films about social issues. So these films are available, but they're not being promoted as such.
Okay. So in a way, the documentary is important in that sense as well, in terms of circulating awareness, or making people more aware of these films and their place in Canadian film history, as part of genre production.
I hope so. And that obviously goes for viewers of the documentary outside Canada, but even within Canada, when I showed this to my colleagues, they said, "Oh, we're not familiar with these films," which on the one hand is fantastic because it means I did some good research, and on the other hand, it also means really surprises me. But I think it also speaks to a discrepancy that Canadian horror film has lived with, which is a discrepancy between its international reputation and its national reputation. And its international reputation is completely different than its national reputation. If Xavier and I talk to Canadian colleagues about how popular a film how popular the films of David Cronenberg are, how well respected they are, or how admired they are, or how well received films like Ginger Snaps are, Canadian colleagues often sort of, they look puzzled. I see that Xavier is back, so he may join us.
Yeah, sorry, living in the country is not that great for internet, so that's one of the downsides. But yeah, so apologies. Hopefully, Ernest answered the end of that question.
He did answer that. I mean, I'm glad you're back, because actually, you mentioned Cronenberg there, Ernest, and that really interesting point that those differences between what people perceive of as Canadian cinema, depending on whether they live in Canada or otherwise. But I have to say, going back to sort of the CinePix part of the documentary, I was really intrigued and loved a comment that one of the contributors made where they said that tax shelter scheme that CinePix and other companies benefited from, that they argued in the documentary that if that hadn't existed, there wouldn't be a David Cronenberg, or at least there wouldn't be a David Cronenberg in the way that we know him, because he would have potentially had a slightly different trajectory in terms of his films and where he made them. I mean, what are your views on that argument? Because I thought it was a really compelling argument in the documentary.
I think it's undeniable that what CinePix did, not just with David Cronenberg, but with a whole generation of filmmakers, William Fruitt, Don Carmody, Ivan Reitman, Denny R. Khan and others, is they really did pioneer a new generation of talent. I'm going to throw a curveball to Ernest, however, and say, without the tax shelter phenomenon, there wouldn't have been a David Cronenberg, but without Pierre David, there wouldn't have been David Cronenberg as an auteur. And why I raise that is because what is very interesting, there's not many published works on CinePix. Mariana has done a very interesting MA thesis on CinePix, and she uses the whole idea of production cultures and industrial knowledge. Theirs was very much an industrial notion of authorship. So one of the things I know Ernest and I have discussed is it's only really when Cronenberg moves out of that Montreal context to Toronto with Pierre David and Victor Solnicki of Film Plan that you start to get the emergence of Cronenberg as an author. And so it's interesting, those early Cronenberg films often get segmented from the authorship debates. Like Cronenberg becomes an author when he moves to Toronto and works with Pierre David. So that was my curveball to Ernest there.
But I think you're right. I mean, and it is Pierre David in the documentary who makes the comment about, obviously as a producer, he would say that without the tax shelter, which is something that a producer uses in order to make the Cronenberg material available, he would say that that's an important component to the entire creative endeavor. And by the way, did you see how many scripts he had lying behind him?
I thought that was brilliant. Absolutely. It's like, how do I know I'm a producer? Look behind me on the desk.
But it's right. And I mean, in my book on Cronenberg, I mentioned that Cronenberg is very much an active auteur. In other words, he's someone who knows how to play the environment that he makes films in. And when in Toronto, he does that really well. And when CinePix is available as an active producing force, he uses that very well. I think it's very much a two-way street, in that CinePix needs someone with the obvious craftsmanship and talent of David Cronenberg, and the ideas that you see explored in films such as Shivers and Rabbit. And then CinePix adds, if you want, I'm sure it's a conversation between Cronenberg and the producers, the elements about, social upheaval in Quebec and the role of Quebec as a province in the wider political environment of Canada. And then Cronenberg adds to that elements of monstrosity and, the things that we know Cronenberg excels in. So I think it's the industrial authorship of CinePix meets the active auteur David Cronenberg. And in that combination, you get films such as Rabbit. But it's true what Xavier says, that when it moves to Toronto, Cronenberg adapts, and the Toronto film, so the environment adapts as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was actually going to pick up on that very idea, because you get this sense in the documentary of a shift in terms of region as Canadian genre production and Canadian horror production develops, so that you start the documentary in Quebec, and obviously you've got the background of the Quiet Revolution, and then the second part is sort of Toronto with the Canadian Film Centre. I mean, is that how you see the development of Canadian horror production, the both of you, that it's something that kind of shifted across regions of Canada in that way?
It certainly did. And, I mean, there were, kind of pivotal crossover figures. So Pierre David obviously has a Montreal basis, but it was Victor Silnicki, his partner, that really embedded him within the Toronto framework. And those were two pivotal centres in the 70s and 80s. I think what we're really interested in with the documentary, and Ernest might want to pick this up, is a couple of things. I mean, it was initially, and people may know, 2 parts. It was a 2-part commission documentary. And so the first part looked mainly at the 70s and a bit of the 80s. And the second part looked at from the 90s to today. And the challenge was during lockdown to try and pull these 2 bits together into one festival cut, which is what we've sort of been touring at the moment. I think, Ernest, for the Canadian Film Centre, people have traditionally seen that more as a pinnacle of national cinema than horror cinema. I know one of the things you were interested in was just redressing that balance, really, and showing a genre imprint for it.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the Canadian Film Centre is it's not a film school. It's a centre that was started by Norman Jewison, and Canadian filmmaker goes to Hollywood. It's a known story, and then comes back and wants to contribute to Canadian film culture. Sets up, or helps set up, inspires the Canadian Film Centre. But from the get-go, even though the brief of the Canadian Film Centre was not to produce genre films, if you look at the first batch of people who get involved at the centre, their interest in the middle of the 1990s is genre cinema. So partly that has to do with the fact that Canada was increasingly becoming a location, and through tax credits also a venue where American genre film and television genre television, the other way around, was being produced. So you have filmmakers there who are seeing that, and I think we can do this, and we can do this as Canadian filmmakers. And some of the stories are more or less the same, and some of them are vastly different, but there was an interest in genre cinema, and Cronenberg played a role in that. The success that he had with films such as The Fly obviously played a role in that. The fact that Jeremy Irons thanks David Cronenberg when he gets an Oscar, not for Dead Ringers, but for Reversal of Fortune, I believe, but he thanks David Cronenberg. That inspires Canadian filmmakers it brings genre on their radar. So the first generation, if you want, of filmmakers who are being mentored, and they mentor each other in the Canadian Film Centre, they have genre very much on their radar, and they compare notes. So when Karen Walton and John Fawcett write Ginger Snaps, they put it on the same table next to Vincenzo Natali, who's American by birth, but he's from Detroit, so he might as well be Canadian. And he puts the script for Cube right next to it. And it's this kind of melting pot, if you want, of inspiration and creativity that then emerges. I mean, Steve Hoban says, I was there as a producer, and I'd not really produced much. I'd done Blood and Donuts with Holly Dale. It's a vampire film. But then along comes Vincenzo Natali with this brilliant script for Cube, and we wanted to test it. So why not do Microcube or Minicube and do a film set in an elevator, call it Elevated, and that way you can test it. So it's the testing ground, a breeding ground. That's a very Cronenbergian way of saying it, but it's a breeding ground for creativity, from which then emerge like John Fawcett, Steve Hoban goes in a further career, Paula Devonshire, Karen Walton, and Vincenzo Natali, and there are many more names. The Canadian Film Centre, it's funny, if you look at the credits, the end credits of Canadian genre films, the Canadian Film Centre it's like a breadcrumb trail of inspiration. If you look at very recent films such as Blood Quantum by Jeff Barnaby, and track that back to his previous film, Rhymes for Young Ghouls, Karen Walton is thanked there as the mentor of Jeff Barnaby in the Canadian Film Centre. So it all goes back. And part of this sort of like a very traditional trail of, one artist is the mentor to the next generation of artists. But it has an industrial component, because these people help each other, applying for tax credits, finding producers, working with producers. So there's a form of industrial authorship at work as well. to answer your initial question, does it move west? It almost seemed too cliche to be true, right? It kind of looks like the gradual settling of the Canadian landscape, to use a colonial metaphor. I think that has to do with means that become available, and locations and craftsmanship and talent that becomes unlocked in regions such as Alberta or British Columbia or elsewhere in Toronto, or, you know, David Church, I see that you're here. You know, you wrote a book on Guy Madden, who's further west than Ontario, but not quite as west as where I am right now. I'm sure in Winnipeg those elements play a role as well. So it is kind of a like further west as a very broad trajectory.
My last question, again, is sort of picking up on something you just said, Ernest, is obviously, as Xavier was saying, in the last part of the documentary, you focus on the more kind of contemporary landscape in terms of genre production in Canada. And you talked a lot about how in the kind of the height in Toronto of the Canadian Film Centre, you have that kind of informal mentorship, you have that kind of development and support going on for filmmakers. Is that still there in various ways for, you know, you focus in that latter section of the documentary on quite a few female filmmakers. Is that kind of mentorship still there? Is there that same kind of system, whether formal or informal, to support and develop filmmakers like that? I mean, the Soska sisters, I think, have collaborated a lot with Mary Harron, and they have a creative relationship. Are there other mentors like that supporting kind of younger filmmakers?
It's a very good question, and yes, there are, and the Soska sisters are a good example, because yes, there's the connection, let's call it the industrial connection they have with Mary Harron, or with Brandon Cronenberg, the son of David Cronenberg, for that matter. So these are industrial, creative, working, professional relationships. But I think the important, and this is something that the industrial authorship element is also one that stands next to an element of a sort of creative community, which is very typical for the horror film industry, in which the distance between fans that are creative and active as, you know, producers or micro producers or even amateur producers, and sometimes professional, and an industry that is fully professional, that distance is very, very small. So the Soska sisters, I actually first interviewed them as part of the fan club of Ginger Snaps. When I was writing the book on Ginger Snaps, I reached out to a couple of people that I knew were part of the, you know, the semi-organized fandom of Ginger Snaps. They call themselves the Pack, and they were very happy to share information. And through that, I discovered that the Soska sisters were fans of Ginger Snaps, and this was right before they started making films. Actually, that's not completely true. They had made Dead Hooker in the Trunk, which is a one. I mean, just for that, I was able to purchase that for the UBC library, and, you know, eyebrows were raised. I'm so proud of that. But they, as I was interviewing them for the book on Ginger Snaps, they said, "Oh yeah, and we're huge fans, and we're hoping to make a film with Catherine Isabel." And lo and behold, they did, and it became American Mary. So these ties are very much alive. And if you, I mean, American Mary is almost 10 years old, but if you pull that through to today, then the Soska sisters themselves, and Xavier can talk about this, they themselves have become mentors for newer generations of filmmakers. And I'll name one example. It's a former student of mine, Shelby Shukaliak, fan of the Soska sisters, was able to meet them, get some funding through an organization, Women in Film and Television in British Columbia. And I believe other provinces in Canada have similar organizations. And, you know, they hooked up together, and Shelby became the producer of a short horror film called Trim. And she's now a professional producer. So these ties are very much alive. And Xavier, the Soska sisters are mentors of your students at BCU, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're very fortunate that we appointed them as our first BCU film fellows. So they, and the incredible thing is about the Soska sisters is just their generosity. So you try and keep a handle on what they're doing because you don't want to appear unprofessional. And then you find they've just been mentoring people on the quiet for weeks on the go, you know, so they're just, they are, I mean, we call them the inspirational Soska sisters, and they are, you know, and
I guess that's that sort of generosity of that independent spirit, Ernest, of those Canadian filmmakers that you get. Apologies, I disappeared again. Now I'm back. One thing I wanted to say, Ernest, is have you spoken yet about Calgary? Because it seems that we've had this shift from, sort of Montreal to Toronto to Vancouver. And there's some interesting work coming out of Calgary right now. And I wondered if colleagues were aware of this or whether you've mentioned it at all.
Only in passing, I'm afraid. So we sort of flew over Calgary, if you want. I think I mentioned Alberta. There is interesting work. If you look at, you can talk about this more in detail than me, Xavier, but if you look at the productions that come out of a production company called 775 Films, based in Calgary, in Alberta, if you look at what comes out of that production unit, and you tie that back, then you can see that, for instance, one of their filmmakers, Rob Grant, is someone who started as an extra, an actor, an extra on the American, but filmed in Vancouver television series Supernatural. So he was an extra whenever he got the opportunity, paid attention very well, started making lo-fi zombie films, one of which is called Yesterday, which is also 10 years old, and gradually moved into professional production. So yeah, Calgary is another sort of emerging location, if you want.
I mean, so 771 are a company that are behind a number of interesting films. So Harpoon, which I think played at Fright Fest a couple of years ago. Antrim, which is a really interesting film, which is supposedly the most dangerous film ever made. And it's a film that I chickened out at because I thought, well, this is just kind of like Blair Witch hype. I know it's Blair Witch hype, that supposedly if you watch this film, you die. So, and it was have you seen it, Kate?
I've watched it and I'm not dead. So,
well,
what we did meant to go.
Yeah, well, what we did is we dispatched our colleague Rob Shaw. We made a load of excuses, say we were really busy, and we let him watch it and see if he kind of turned up, and he did. But again, it's like they seem to be moving from region to region. So Calgary is somewhere to keep an eye on, I guess, at the moment.
That's really interesting. We've got lots of questions coming in, so I'll focus on some of them. We've got a couple from John Root. So John Root is saying, at Cine Access 2019, Xavier, I presume this is for Xavier, you praised the Birmingham City University students' involvement in the making of the Quiet Revolution. Can you tell us a bit more about how they helped with the film's production?
Good question. I was sort of grimaced at thinking 2019. Can I remember that far back? But I can actually. So one of the things we're really blessed with, and it's probably the same at places like Hertfordshire and Northumbria, is that the university invests heavily in production equipment. The interesting challenge is coming out of the pandemic, will higher education ever be the same again? I don't think it will be. But the old model, tried and tested, was to pump loads of production equipment into an institution as a way of recruiting students. Challenge is, of course, if none of them can get access to it. Fortunately for that production, the students were able to help. So to answer John Root's question, they helped in a number of capacities. What we try and do is really shift around the student skill set. So we have a number of BSc film students who are really good on production, but what we try and do is let them research, so it gives them a skill set that they're not normally used to. So it's a transferable skill that they can use when they leave. So some students worked on researching the project. Some students worked on the editing of the project. Some students worked on the grading, and some students worked on sound design. And what's really great, I think, for those students is a number of them were just first years when they did that. So I think it's really great that they did, you know, such an extensive piece of work on that project.
I've got another one from John as well. This is a really great question, actually. Are there any films or filmmakers that you had to cut from discussing in the documentary that you would have liked to cover but didn't have the space?
Yeah,
I'll actually go on, Ernest.
Why don't you go first, Xavier? I'll make
well,
up
okay, well, ever so briefly, Kate asked a really pertinent question about Canadian slashers. So you might think it was a real illusion, Kate, not to have Canadian slashers in there. So we did have Canadian slashers in there, but we sort of removed it because we didn't have enough time to cover it. So Canadian slashers and that genre would be really good. And Ernest, what else do you think?
Among the more recent generation, if you want, filmmakers such as Jeff Barnaby was very much on our radar. Jeff actually was invited to come to Vancouver in February 2020, and we were going to shoot an interview, and I was going to convince Xavier to splice it in the documentary. It was in February 2020, and was for a one-day symposium that was called The End of the World. And then the world did end, and he didn't show up. And so so that was one thing that, but there are others. Jennifer Morden, who's the production designer for a marvelous short Indigenous First Nation horror film called Awakening. And we interviewed her, weren't able to use that footage. And Sama Monani, American scholar writing on First Nation storytelling and drawing a parallel with ecological disaster narratives and horror genre. So that was a brilliant interview. Didn't end up using it, and several others as well. So yes, it could have been a lot longer.
Yeah, I'm sure, absolutely. John did have a final question, which is: the film has been screened and released in separate parts already. Will it be released widely as a whole in the future, perhaps on disc or digitally? You have screened it as a festival cut, haven't you? Is that right?
Yeah. The challenge here is it's been released in the UK as 2 parts. We are looking into, so it's nothing really you can do there. People aren't going to want to see it again in 1 part, possibly, but we're looking at North America as another area we could release a festival cut. The challenge is that a lot of platforms now are removing independent film content from their catalogues. So maybe because everyone's been stuck at home, people are gravitating towards these online platforms, but they're sort of, what was a venue for independent film often is being removed. So actually it's a bit more of a challenge than you'd realise to get documentaries on there, but we're hopeful, we're looking at it.
Fingers crossed, absolutely. I've got a question from Stacey Abbott, who says, thank you for making this documentary. She really enjoyed it. And she says, you called the documentary The Quiet Revolution, coming out of Quebec culture and politics. And she wondered if you came across any French-Canadian horror films.
Yeah, we did.
Well, actually, go on, Ernest.
I looked one up just for you, Stacey. It's called Le Diable Parmi Nous.
Yes.
We weren't able to get a good interview on that, but yes, there are several, and it's interesting that Cinepix, Xavier, I'll give this to you, but Cinepix actually straddles the French language as well as the English language market in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, that was the example I was going to use. So I mean, in relation to those early, so Cinepix pioneered what became known as maple syrup porn movies, the idea of erotic films with an eye towards the social transitions in mid to late 60s Canada. Then they started, so before Cronenberg, they started dipping the toe in the water of horror with French horror. And that's one example. I think there's a lot more work, Ernest, that could be done on that, around those kind of French overlaps. Yeah,
there was a conference paper that André Loiselle presented at a Film Studies Association of Canada conference. This is a while ago, and I'm pretty sure either it made its way into publication as a journal article, or he's still working on it. But there's very very fertile territory there. Thanks for the question, Stacey. Great question.
Got another one from Stacey. Actually, she's asking, will the interviews you didn't use ever be made available online for research purposes, because they sound great?
Stacey, if this, and Ernest might want to come in, if there's a model really for what we have been doing here, and to be fair, the BC have been very generous in their support. I mean, we've had a number of documentaries that we've produced at BCU. I guess Andrew Spicer did a study of Michael Klinger, the British B-movie film producer, and I think that's a kind of model. And he made a lot of the materials available as an online archival resource. So, I mean, I do, and Ernest and I have discussed the fact that that could be another avenue, because I know, Ernest, you're also gathering more and more interview materials. So it really would be good to let it see the light of day, maybe as a UBC-BCU project or as a funded project.
Yeah, it's a great question, Stacey. And so, yes, one of we are working on more materials. So I have a PhD student right now who's going. I mean, COVID threw a big, huge, fat wrench into a lot of the plans, but we are planning interviews, a renewed interview with Vincenzo Natali, a renewed interview with Karen Walton, because of course, last time we spoke to them, it's been a couple of years and their careers have flourished and moved on since. Sukhian Lee is a filmmaker, more than a filmmaker, also a radio broadcaster and a general storyteller and a singer as well, singer-songwriter as well, is someone who we're interviewing, particularly around two recent films, Octavio is Dead and Death and Sickness. Death and Sickness was made during the lockdown in Toronto. So, but I think the larger thing is here to build a sort of living archive of interviews that are professionally conducted. And I don't mean me, the person asking the questions, but in terms of like filming it, making sure the sound is good, making sure the quality of the material is decent so that they can be used in a classroom environment as those classrooms become ever more digital. And I've tried this out with my own students a couple of months ago, and it seems to work quite well. So on a graduate level, here are some interviews that are not in the documentary. Here they are in their entirety. Use for your paper the parts that you think are useful, and it seemed to work quite all right.
Absolutely, it's great when you can use that material in teaching in that way. You know, it's really fantastic. Question from Laura May. She says, you opened your discussion by talking about the broader connections between national cinema and horror in terms of social context, industry concerns, etc. But it's clear from the documentary and your later discussion that we can identify cycles of horror coming out of various provinces or cities at different times. So can we understand, or might we understand, much Canadian horror as being kind of regional horror as opposed to national horror cinema? And she says, you know, she's stirring the big pot of national cinema debates there, she realises, by asking that question.
I think it's a really astute observation. I mean, from my perspective, sitting here in Stafford, in the UK, I'd say there's a lot of mileage in Laura's analysis there, because it's not only the fact that there are these regional trends, and you can almost chart broadly the years or the decade where there's a Quebec focus, a Toronto focus, a Vancouver focus, or a Calgary focus. But one of the interesting things is that these funding incentives were also regionalised, so there were regional focuses for funds people could apply to. So I think both at that regional level and the funding level, there's a lot more research that could be done around that regionality. Would you agree, Ernest?
Absolutely. And in a way, Canada, because it is such a big country, challenges the very notion of what it is to have a nation state, yes, right? What it is to be a nation. But I think you can apply it to all kinds of environments. I mean, in Belgium, you can make a distinction between Flemish and Walloon cinema, and within the US, there's a Southern Gothic cinema. So we are already doing that research. We are already noticing these regional differences. And sometimes they're in terms of mood and atmosphere and aesthetics, and sometimes they are in terms of, you know, funding. If you look at if you look at the tax credits that the state of Georgia offers, and you link that to what comes out of the state of what comes out of there, and I'm pretty sure you could make an argument that it stands to a certain extent different from other aspects. Something that's filmed in California, there's a Californian Gothic, a Southern Gothic. I mean, we recognize films that come out of the Mississippi Delta, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in a way we're already doing that. So I don't think yes, it's stirring the pot of national cinema, but I think it's also a challenge that the study of national cinema needs to engage with.
I was just going to add something to this. Has anyone in the audience heard of the movie Feed the Devil? Does that ring a bell with anyone? I think you can get it on Amazon now. It's a very uneven film, but I think it's interesting even in its unevenness, and Ernest and I have spoken about it. It was a Montreal-Bristol co-production. So it was basically Cannibal Ferox refilmed in an indigenous environment. And so it's the idea of drug runners go into a Native American environment, you know, sort of don't respect the natives, and horror comes out as a result. But again, it just shows you that really fluid way in which different regions can work together. So, you know, it's a very unlikely pair in Bristol, I think through Creative England, and then Montreal, and you get, you know, Feed the Devil as one example of that.
Fascinating. Question from David Church, and it's going back to what you were just saying there about the Canadian slasher, Xavier. And David's saying, could you speak a bit to how some of the Canadian horror films, like Prom Night, Terror Train, etc., deliberately disguise themselves as culturally odorless in order to pass as US films instead of marking themselves as distinctly Canadian content? David says maybe that would have fit more with the potential Canadian slasher section if you'd had that, especially if you compare that to examples with a very maritime set like My Bloody Valentine, which I looked up, and that was filmed in Nova Scotia.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, reception information wasn't necessarily available, David, for all of these films, because I mean, Prom Night was not a Cinepix production, as was Terror Train, but there's some general brushstrokes, and Ernest might want to sort of jump in here as well, that we can talk about, which is they were part and parcel of the controversy around the tax shelter phenomenon. Because if you look in the tax shelter phenomenon, the peak period for tax shelter productions was 1979 to 1980, which coincides with the slasher film boom in Canada. And the reviews repeatedly are what are really of a phenomenon you talk about, where there appears to be a disguise. There seems to be a pairing between older and younger actors. Either there's an importing of an American director, so the whole idea of the Canadianness is disguised. It could well be, however, that there are more subtle kind of Canadian markers there. So if you look at something like My Bloody Valentine and have a look at the press reviews of My Bloody Valentine, there's a grudging respect for its Nova Scotia settings. I mean, the reviewers talk about the fact that this is one of the few slashers to acknowledge Canadian landscape, but it's still a terrible film, you know, in their perception. So the whole idea of landscape or Moosehead beer appearing in a film are kind of subtle markers of Canadianness, as is a disrespect for MPAA rules. So when My Bloody Valentine went to the US, it was heavily cut because it was seen as too extreme even for the slasher cycle. So I think there are subtle markers in some of these films that do distinguish themselves. And I think My Bloody Valentine is probably, I don't know, Ernest, the most Canadian. Would you agree of that cycle?
Suddenly, definitely in my experience. It's also one that here in the west of Canada, whenever a retrospective of Canadian slasher, if ever, I think it's happened only once, a retrospective of Canadian slasher films, then it's My Bloody Valentine is the one that comes along. And Prom Night, thanks to, of course, the involvement of Paul Lynch. But I think, David, you're absolutely right that they are, to a certain extent, I mean, they are made with two mindsets at the same time. On the one hand, it's we're in Canada, we're making a Canadian film because we're here. We look around and this is the environment that the film is being made in. And then at the same time, there's a market in the mind of the people who make it. And the market is inevitably North American. So inevitably it's the US. It's a way bigger market. So that already dictates from the get-go a number of creative decisions. So they are culturally odorless in that if that synergy with two mindsets doesn't work well, you end up with something that's extremely bland. At best, it works. It appeals to both mindsets. You got something that's distinctly creative Canadian and something that appeals to the mass American market. But there's also historical aspect here in that these films have been around, particularly the slasher ones, have been around for a couple of decades, and different generations of audiences look at them with different lenses. So if I show these slasher films to my students now, when, or particularly during the Trump administration, when Canada was really desperately seeking to differentiate itself from the United States culturally, politically, etc., then my students are eager to find the Canadian elements in there. At other times, they see them as American films. If I screen it as part of a Canadian film class, they'll see it as a Canadian film. If they screen it as part of a American horror class, they'll see it as American horror film. So there's a historical element to that, to how these films are being perceived as well.
Thank you. Really, really interesting answer and interesting question as well from David. Thank you for that. Steve Jones has a question. He says, thank you for the opportunity to see the documentary as part of this event. And he says, towards the end of the documentary, there was a clear focus, which Xavier's alluded to briefly, on marginalised and underrepresented voices. Is that characteristic of Canadian filmmaking ethos? So, for example, because Canada is a proximate other to Hollywood, or does it have more to do with horror championing such voices, for example, because it's an outsider genre, so that there's that kind of parity, I guess, for want of a better word?
It's both. It's definitely both. So it's characteristic for Canadian filmmaking ethos, because if you put forward a proposal to a funding agency, you will be at pains to say this is not something that is made for the American market. This because it's made with Canadian tax dollars, this expresses and addresses and challenges Canadian cultural identity, whichever way you phrase it. So there's that element. So that is part of an ethos. How that articulates, how that is expressed in the final product that is being delivered is a whole different matter. But that's an outset. And then at the same time, yes, several of the people we interviewed, all of the voices that you hear near the end of the documentary, Naila Inuksuk and Gigi Sol Guerrero, Vince D'Amato's only in there very briefly, all of them, and also the ones that we didn't include, they say horror is for us the perfect vehicle to address these elements of cultural diversity, of the othering of certain cultural articulations and expressions versus others, whether it's diaspora, immigration, ethnicity. Naila Inuksuk said, I learn a lot from watching horror films, so I can apply that and combine that with indigenous traditions of storytelling. And then she makes beautiful films as a result of that. So that mix is very important, and horror is a very important tool in that.
I totally agree. And just to add to that, I mean, one other thing I think for Indigenous, or the challenges for Indigenous filmmakers, is there are funding schemes for Indigenous filmmakers that you can apply to, but the National Film Board offers a documentary fund, for instance, but they tend to be targeted towards realist stories. So what you often find is that Indigenous genre filmmakers start off in documentary to cut their teeth, and then they move over to horror. So it's about navigating and negotiating, and we go back to what I increasingly feel is not a national cinema at all. Laura's right, it's a collection of regional cinemas. But one of the challenges of that is that Indigenous filmmakers within the academic work have been traditionally targeted towards that documentary domain. So they're having to rethink and renegotiate how they're seen within that critical context, I guess.
Thank you both, and thank you for the question, Steve. I've got a question from Craig Mann, who's been very honest here. He says he has to apologise, first of all, because he hasn't had the chance to watch the documentary yet, but he's on it tonight. He wondered if you'd looked at the admittedly horror-adjacent work that Paul Donovan was doing in Nova Scotia in the 1980s, like Siege and DEFCON 4.
Wow. Ernest, do you want to?
You can see Ernest nodding away.
Yeah, I'm nodding. It's Nova Scotia again, right? So if there's a Quiet Revolution Part 3, we'll have to go to Nova Scotia. We'll ask Sidney Crosby to be our guide there when we're when we're there. Yes, I'm aware of the work of Paul Donovan. It didn't happen. I mean, these are films that articulate, I think it matches, if I may, Craig, and you may disagree with this, I would love to hear your take on it as well. But I think it matches this idea that, you know, we've already mentioned Nova Scotia 5 times now. So it's already presented itself as a separate case, if you want. But I'd love to hear how you see the connection. I'm not sure if it's possible for Craig to turn on his microphone and perhaps see if they can make the connection.
Craig, would you be willing to do that, or to comment in the chats? Mike doesn't work on this laptop, unfortunately.
Oh, that's too bad. Contact us via email, because I think there's something very, very interesting there. And I think it's definitely worth exploring and as part of the general conversation that we're having. Yeah,
Craig saying I love DEF CON 4 for feeling like a distinctly Canadian Mad Max, and that he'll drop you an email.
Oh, fantastic!
These were very, very, very low budget films as well. The films that Craig is talking about. So I had some. There was a proof of concept we did back in 2017 called Tax Shelter Terror. So there was a proof of concept for the Quiet Revolution, and we ended up vicariously working with some of the DEF CON 4 people. And so these were real guerrilla films that were made, you know, like a response to no more funding being available. So they're like the real marginal guerrilla Canadian filmmakers that need further coverage, I guess.
That's interesting, because in a way, what Vince D'Amato's films, like I have one behind me here, Valley of the Rats, which is a horror film about homelessness in Vancouver. These kind of films, we'll have to continue this conversation, Craig. I look forward to your email, because I think there's a lot there.
I agree.
And I think we've already established that we're going to need a third part of the documentary on Nova Scotia. I think that's now clear, isn't it? We've got a question from Aaron McMillan, and Aaron is going to, I think, come on the mic and camera to ask his question. Is that right, Aaron?
Yeah, that's right, Kit. Thank you. Sorry, I can't figure out how to word it properly.
No problem.
Thank you. I actually asked a similar question during the conference the other week, although not in the panel about the Quiet Revolution, which I only saw since then. I thought it was wonderful. But this is kind of leading from the last couple of questions. The films that you talk about in the first half of the documentary, as you say, were not well received at all. I mean, it's you know, looking at some of the reviews of the Cronenberg films, for example, I mean, it's quite, you know, they were coming from a place, they were met with a lot of hostility, and as you said, even retrospectively, you know, those films are still kind of cordoned off. The second half of the documentary is very different in that those films are coming, they're emerging at a time when it seems like academic discourse and critical discourse and the genre and the industry are all kind of in alignment. That changes things to an extent, I would think. What do you think about? I mean, the huge advantage is that we now have a multiplicity of voices that either weren't there or were having other people speak for them. The other side of that is that, as we had just been talked about, the idea of horror as an outsider genre. If you take away that element of antagonism, of, you know, pressing against things, then that changes that. You know, what happens when an outsider genre isn't an outsider anymore? Is, I guess, what I'm asking. I mean, it seems like a lot of films today, you know, your work is indispensable in excavating these histories that it seems like right now are kind of being dealt with seriously in real time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. That very much makes sense. I hope so, I think, is my short answer. I hope that if the latter part of the documentary shows that talking about horror genre film in the Canadian context has become more acceptable, perhaps even respectable, then, and if that's what you mean with that sort of alignment, then I actually think that you're right. I'm not sure to what extent that impact on the second part of your question, or to what extent that impacts on the sort of persistence of the horror genre as the other. I think that's a difficult one for me at least, to get my head around. Maybe, but I think for the first part, yes. I think if you compare, Xavier talked about this, the difficulty that Cinepics as a cultural marker has in achieving respectability in a study of Canadian cinema in general. I mean, just the very word seems to be avoided for the longest of time. And if you compare that to recent efforts to have the work of Gigi Sol-Guerrero, Naila Inuksook, Dennis Goulet, Jeff Barnaby mentioned in academic discourse, yes, then definitely it's going in the right way. It's going in the right direction. But I'm not sure that's, I don't quite, I don't know how to connect that to whether or not the horror genre is now less of an other to the rest of the industry or the rest of culture than before. So I'll pass on to Xavier for that. But I hope I think that's the first part of it.
Yeah, I mean,
Definitely,
I think it's really interesting. I mean, by no way answering your question, Aaron. I mean, back in, I think it was CineXS 2019, we did have a fascinating documentary that seemed to go down well with the audience on, it was the first documentary on Native American horror. So it was, how the importance of Native American myths and how they get translated into horror. And in the Q&A, it was 2020 because we did it online, not 2019. And the filmmaker, we were speaking, and we mentioned the fact that there are Canadian, that Canada has a renewed interest in indigenous horror through the likes of Naila Inuksook as one example. And the response was still, it's around funding, because what, again, these filmmakers are doing is they're negotiating and hijacking official state funds that are usually used for realist vehicles to create an imprint and then do genre. So I wonder, Ernest, if the imprint that we're talking about, the Dennis Goulet and the Naila Inuksook, whether they're for their non-genre works or for their genre works, does that make sense? Whether this or whether what we're doing is reproducing that segmenting that we saw with Cinepics in the 70s, it effectively evacuate these films from their genre context to make them more palatable.
It's definitely something that these two filmmakers struggle with. And at the same time, they have a very simple answer for it. If you ask Dennis and Naila about, what's this sort of distinction or the synthesis between you making a horror film from an indigenous perspective and making a documentary about, the Arctic North. And they say, well, just try and get a camera up there. It becomes a documentary in its own right, just getting the gear up there. So that very challenge is something that impacts on the production. That's not new in and of itself. And in a way, it kind of like made me think about maybe we should watch these documentaries through a horror genre lens as well, because they are harsh endeavors. And they sort of push the boundaries of what storytelling means in a certain landscape, in a certain environment. There's Kajutaijuk, which is a short film by Naila Inuksook, tells about it's an open Arctic landscape. There's snow everywhere, and my first reaction was, I can't see a thing. But 30 seconds, 45 seconds into the film, you start seeing things. And at that point, it's not clear to me whether I'm watching a documentary about the Arctic or whether I'm watching a horror film, whether my horror glasses are on or my documentary glasses are on. And the fact that the two things become blurred is hugely interesting. And when pressed on it, Naila said, yeah, that's what I'm aiming for. I want to blur that boundary. So there's a little bit of that there as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Aaron. David, who also earlier was mentioning some other Nova Scotia horror films. I think he was mentioning that The Lighthouse was filmed in Nova Scotia. But David's also got another question as well. He says, have you interviewed any of the Astron 6 guys out of Winnipeg, Father's Day, the editor, The Void, Psycho Gorman, as part of the younger generation, especially since so much of this stuff is kind of retro styled or semi-parodic?
The answer is no, and the answer is I consider Quiet Revolution Part 4 as well as Part 3 here, because there's just more and more stuff that's kind of out there. I mean, Ernest, do you want to add to that?
Just to echo what you said, I recognize Father's Day, and I sort of like go like this in my head. Yes, absolutely. But I think so. We've been discussing this now for a little under an hour, and there's like there's a list of about a dozen titles that have appeared. I think it shows that there's fertile ground for further research. I know this sounds like the kind of answer that you would give to a funding agency in any given day, but I think that the substance is actually there in that, and it also speaks to a kind of methodology of the living archive, in that a lot of this history is not set in stone. A lot of this history is being written as we speak. These archives are living archives. They are being collected. They depend on the generosity of people who collect materials that have not yet been institutionalized. In other words, they're not in formal archives or libraries yet or altogether. So I think there's also methodologically a great opportunity here in making these observations, collecting these materials, and then as we proceed, see how it fits ideas about national cinema, regional cinema, traveling cinema, etc., etc. So I think it's a very good question, David. I'm going to explore that now. We're going to have to.
Yeah, I think to give you some brief kind of production context to how, because it was a commission piece, so we didn't travel around from region to region. Would be an embedded Los Angeles crew, an embedded Montreal crew, an embedded Toronto crew, and Ernest was part of the embedded Vancouver crew. So in a way, we were sort of very much, the scope of what we did was very much predetermined by funding and where the crews were. So it's obvious that there are several avenues that need further exploration. And I think it would be a great follow-on set of projects.
Fantastic! It's great that so much as that has come out of this event. Discussion and identification, as Ian has said, of all these different films and areas. I wanted to actually ask about censorship, if that's all right. It's kind of very predictable that I would ask something about that. But it was briefly mentioned in the documentary. So there was a couple. I think it was Pierre David mentioned it, or one of your contributors referred to the Canadian Censorship Board, and I don't know a lot about the Canadian Censorship Board, but I've always been quite fascinated by them because I know they are quite stringent. So I just wondered, where do they fit into this story here? To what extent did the board intervene in any of the kind of the films that you talk about, maybe the Cinepix era, maybe Cronenberg's films, or even Ginger Snaps, considering that when that came out, there was a lot of media attention around that. What role did the board play in with regards to any of those films?
I'm going to hand over to our Cronenberg expert, actually. But
so
before I love Cinepix encountered, where Cinepix encountered a lot. Yeah, where Cinepix did encounter censorship issues were mainly around the maple syrup porn movies and also around a series of films that are often seen as the hidden Canadian cult cycle, which is the Ilsa films. So Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, a series of films about a kind of a sadistic female camp warden, were actually made by Cinepix under pseudonyms. So they particularly caught the ire of the Canadian censor, particularly the first one for its representations of concentration camp activities. In terms of Cronenberg, Ernest, I mean, beyond the controversy that Shivers produced, what are your thoughts on the censorship?
Well, Cronenberg speaks about it a lot. There's footage which we weren't able to include in the documentary of David Cronenberg speaking out in 1987. So this is right after the release of The Fly, which was a huge success, one of the two biggest summer hits of 1986, together with Aliens, I believe, also Canadian director. So definitely a summer that belonged to Canada in terms of genre cinema. But in 1987, there was a strike of the librarians in the province of Ontario. And this had to do with a bill that was being proposed that would make it criminally illegal for those who pass on materials that a court would subsequently find obscene. To which librarians said, that means if someone gets a book from us and they argue that it's obscene, and that book, that impression gets upheld, that I go to jail as a librarian. So they went on strike to protest the bill. And David Cronenberg was one of two speakers. The other one was Margaret Atwood at a rally in Toronto, speaking out at the public library in Toronto, speaking out. And there's some wonderful footage of that because, you know, Margaret Atwood, great writer, very eloquent in her speech. And poor Mr. Cronenberg stands there and says, well, I make films and they've been censored, but I can't explain it the way Margaret Atwood does. And I would have loved that to be in the documentary, but it wasn't of good enough quality. But the part that is relevant, I think, is that, first of all, there's no overall federal Canadian censorship board. Every province has its own censorship and classification. Laura, this is speaking to your argument about challenging the idea of national cinema. If Ontario bans a film, and Ontario has until a couple of years ago, a notoriously strict censorship board, that doesn't mean Alberta or Vancouver, or sorry, British Columbia, have to do the same thing. Far from it. Quebec has a completely different legislation in that respect altogether. So this makes censorship a very tricky thing. You can have your film censored in Ontario, and if you're Cronenberg and you live in Toronto, which is in Ontario, that's a disaster. But the rest of the country, they don't care too much about that. So a way for a federal government with a conservative impulse to get around that is to censor at the funding. And that is something that has happened to David Cronenberg, to Ginger Snaps, and to several of the films that we explore in the documentary. When the Shivers controversy burst, it wasn't a question about whether or not this was an obscene film. It was a question about how can we possibly, why on earth did we fund this film? So up until recently, and I looked this up, this is from the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law, a paper on Bill C-10. This is a bill on protecting the cultural and moral sensitivities of the Canadian population. It's a bill that comes up on occasion. Every time it comes up, it gets voted down because there's public outcry. And a lot of that public outcry is around, you can't just call something obscene because you don't like it. And every time in the public discussion around that bill, horror films get mixed up together with all kinds of other snuff movies. I'm speaking here to people who are familiar with the video Nazis, and I know you are, Kate. It's the same type of repeated moral panic time and time and time again. It hardly ever leads to anything. But in the meantime, films such as Ginger Snaps or Sookie and Lee's films get mixed up in these controversies time and again. Sometimes that actually has an impact. The casting for Ginger Snaps had to be removed from Ontario to British Columbia, from Toronto to Vancouver, because the casting agencies in Toronto refused to do the casting for a film that they said glorified high school violence. This was in the wake of the Columbine shooting in 1999. This is when the casting for Ginger Snaps happened. They boycotted it. So this is censorship at the funding. Instead, the casting, what did Stephen Hoban and John Foster do? They moved the casting to British Columbia, which had no such qualms about casting a film that doesn't even, in my mind, doesn't even remotely resemble the Columbine shooting in any sort of mediatized representation. But as a result, Emily Perkins and Catherine Isabel got the parts, and they moved to Toronto, and the film got shot anyway. So it's in these ways that censorship is an active component in the public discourse around horror film in Canada, for sure.
I mean, I think, the critics in this area talk about the move from the Canadian Film Development Corporation, which was the funding body that facilitated, this flourish in genre production. When that was kind of moved to telefilm in 1984, you know, critics say, well, it was basically code for more Canadian Mounties and less Canadian serial killer films. So the whole idea was that this experiment has not developed a great national cinema. You've had loads of horror movies, and worse, loads of horror movies that appear to be disguised so they don't look Canadian. So the censorship very much exists, or those, you know, those barriers exist at the funding levels. And I think you see it today, most definitely.
Fantastic. We've covered such a lot of ground in the last hour and 20 minutes. It's been fantastic. I think we're done with questions. So I think we'll probably wrap things up there. But I just want to thank you both for your time, for giving us access to the film as well, which we've all enjoyed watching. And I'm sure there'll be lots of thank yous in the chat as well. You know, as Ernest says, was it Canada Film Day? Is that right, Ernest?
It is. It's April the 21st. It's Canada Film Day.
So it couldn't be more perfect. I've had this event today, which is great. So thank you to you both. You know, good luck with the continued fortunes of the film. I'm sure we'll hear. I mean, it's already won a couple of festival awards, hasn't it? So, you know, hope to hear more about its fortunes. Keep us informed, and it'll always be something we support. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. I really liked the conversation. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for the questions, and thanks for having us.
And you can get on with the rest of your day now, Ernest, because I'm guessing it's probably only 11:30 there, or something like that. Or getting on for 11:30.
Yeah, you all can have an evening drink. I can't yet.
I won't be long.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thanks very much, everyone. And just to let you know that the next Wednesday Night Bite event will be on the 26th of May, again at 6 o'clock, and that'll be a book launch for the book 21st Century Gothic with Reyes and a number of other editors and contributors to that book. So there'll be more details about registration for that event coming soon on our social media feeds. And yeah, Shelley is putting it there. Have a look at our website and our Twitter feed for details of forthcoming events, not just the next one, but beyond as well. And thank you again, Xavier and Ernest. It's been an absolute pleasure. Really enjoyed the discussion. I'm sure everyone here has too. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.